Welcome, friend, to this peaceful exploration of a time when humanity's greatest triumph became its most devastating curse. Tonight, we journey to Victorian London, where the very systems designed to save lives would unleash horrors beyond imagination. Whether you're settling in for the evening, or simply seeking to understand how progress can spiral into catastrophe, I'm grateful you're here with me on this sobering journey through history's most ironic disaster. Have you ever wondered how an entire civilization could engineer its own destruction while believing it was creating paradise? The answer lies in the fog-shrouded streets of 19th century London, where the miracle of modern sanitation became the architect of mass death on a scale that would make medieval plagues seem merciful by comparison. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about progress and public health. This wasn't simply a case of good intentions gone wrong. This was a systematic transformation of an entire city into a death trap, orchestrated by the very people who claimed to be saving it from disease and squalor. Today, I'm going to take you inside the hidden catastrophe that Victorian authorities desperately tried to cover up. You'll discover how the installation of revolutionary sewage systems created conditions far more deadly than anything London had ever experienced. You'll meet the real people who lived through this nightmare and understand why the most sanitary period in London's history was also its most lethal. By the end of this journey, you'll see the Industrial Revolution in a completely different light. But before we descend into those pristine yet poisonous streets, let me paint you the picture of how London became the epicenter of humanity's most well-intentioned disaster. The year was 1858, and London was experiencing what contemporary observers called the Great Awakening of urban civilization. The Thames sparkled with unprecedented cleanliness. The streets gleamed with revolutionary drainage systems. The air itself seemed fresher as ancient cesspits disappeared beneath networks of gleaming iron pipes. Queen Victoria herself had proclaimed that London would become the jewel of the modern world, a testament to British ingenuity and the triumph of science over the primitive conditions that had plagued humanity for millennia. The great engineering minds of the age had gathered in the capital, their blueprints promising to eliminate the diseases and filth that had made urban life a constant battle against death itself. But beneath this gleaming facade of progress, something far more sinister was taking shape. The very innovations that were supposed to liberate Londoners from centuries of pestilence were creating conditions that would prove catastrophically worse than anything the city had ever endured. Dr. Edmund Whitmore was among the first to notice that something was terribly wrong. A respected physician serving the affluent neighborhoods of Kensington, Whitmore had initially celebrated the sanitation reforms with the same enthusiasm as his colleagues. His medical practice had thrived as patients flocked to him, praising the obvious improvements in their living conditions. The new sewage systems had eliminated the nauseating odors that had plagued London for generations. Families no longer needed to empty chamber pots into streets or maintain private cesspits that bred disease and attracted vermin. The revolutionary network of underground pipes whisked away human waste with mechanical efficiency that seemed almost magical to people who had spent their entire lives managing the unpleasant realities of urban sanitation. But Dr. Whitmore began to notice disturbing patterns in his patient records that contradicted the narrative of progress and improvement that dominated public discourse. Children who had previously suffered from predictable seasonal ailments were developing mysterious conditions that defied conventional diagnosis. Adults who had lived healthy lives in the same neighborhoods for decades were suddenly experiencing symptoms that seemed to have no connection to any known diseases. The symptoms themselves were unlike anything Whitmore had encountered during his medical training or years of practice. Patients complained of persistent fatigue that seemed to drain their life force gradually over months. Digestive problems appeared and disappeared without apparent cause. Most troubling were the neurological symptoms that seemed to affect thinking and behavior in subtle but unmistakable ways. Sarah Mitchell, a housewife whose family had lived in the same Kensington terrace for 3 generations, exemplified the mysterious decline that was affecting households throughout the newly sanitized districts. Sarah had been known throughout her neighborhood as an energetic woman who managed her household with remarkable efficiency while raising 4 children and maintaining an extensive garden. But within months of the new sewage system's installation, Sarah began experiencing episodes of confusion and disorientation that left her unable to perform simple tasks she had completed effortlessly for years. She would forget the names of neighbors she had known for decades. She would start cooking meals and then abandon them half-finished, staring blankly at pots and pans as if she had never seen them before. Her husband, Thomas, initially attributed these changes to the stress of adjusting to modern conveniences. The new plumbing systems required different maintenance routines, and he assumed Sarah was simply overwhelmed by learning new procedures for managing their household's sanitary arrangements. But Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate in ways that had nothing to do with domestic adjustment. She began experiencing severe headaches that lasted for days. Her appetite disappeared, and she lost weight rapidly, despite having access to better food than ever before. Most disturbingly, she developed a persistent cough that physicians could not explain or treat effectively. Thomas brought Sarah to Dr. Whitmore's clinic in the autumn of 1858, hoping that the respected physician could diagnose and treat whatever mysterious ailment had transformed his vibrant wife into a shadow of her former self. But Dr. Whitmore found himself unable to identify any specific disease or condition that could account for Sarah's symptoms. The examination revealed no obvious signs of infection, malnutrition, or physical injury that could explain her decline. Her vital signs were within normal ranges, and she showed no evidence of the common diseases that typically affected women of her age and social class. Yet she was clearly suffering from something that was systematically destroying her health and cognitive abilities. Dr. Whitmore began to suspect that Sarah's case was not an isolated incident when other patients from newly sanitized neighborhoods began presenting with similar mysterious symptoms. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable to a physician who had been carefully documenting changes in his patient population since the sanitation reforms had been implemented. The affected individuals came from different social backgrounds and lived in different parts of the city, but they all shared one common characteristic. They lived in buildings that had been connected to the new sewage systems that were being hailed as the greatest advancement in public health since the discovery of vaccination. Margaret Thompson, a governess employed by a wealthy merchant family, had developed symptoms remarkably similar to Sarah's despite living in completely different circumstances. Margaret was well-educated, financially secure, and had access to the best medical care available in London. Yet she was experiencing the same mysterious decline that was affecting housewives, labourers, and children throughout the sanitized districts. Margaret's employers, the Ashford family, had been among the first to install the revolutionary sewage systems in their Bloomsbury mansion. They had invested enormous sums in the latest plumbing technology, creating what contemporary magazines described as a model of modern domestic sanitation that other wealthy families throughout London sought to emulate. The Ashford mansion featured multiple water closets, sophisticated drainage systems, and ventilation arrangements that eliminated the unpleasant odours and health hazards associated with traditional waste management methods. The family took pride in their progressive approach to domestic hygiene and frequently hosted social gatherings where they displayed their sanitary innovations to impress visitors. But within months of the system's installation, Margaret began experiencing the same constellation of symptoms that was appearing throughout London's newly sanitized neighborhoods. Her mental clarity, which had been essential for her work as a governess, began to deteriorate in ways that made it increasingly difficult for her to fulfill her educational responsibilities. The Ashford children, whom Margaret had taught successfully for several years, began complaining that their lessons had become confusing and inconsistent. Margaret would start explaining mathematical concepts and then lose track of her thoughts mid-sentence. She would assign reading materials and then forget what she had requested, creating frustration and confusion for students who had previously thrived under her instruction. Mrs. Ashford initially attributed Margaret's declining performance to personal problems, or perhaps romantic distractions that were interfering with her professional focus. The wealthy woman had little sympathy for servants who allowed their private concerns to affect their work, and she began considering whether Margaret should be replaced with a more reliable governess. But when Margaret began experiencing the same physical symptoms that were affecting other residents of sanitized buildings, Mrs. Ashford realized that something more serious was occurring. Margaret's persistent cough, unexplained fatigue, and digestive problems could not be dismissed as personal failings or professional incompetence. The Ashford family consulted their private physician, Dr. Harrison Blackwood, a prominent medical practitioner who served many of London's wealthiest families. Dr. Blackwood was known for his modern approach to medicine and his enthusiasm for the scientific innovations that were transforming medical practice throughout the British Empire. Dr. Blackwood examined Margaret thoroughly, but found himself unable to identify any specific condition that could account for her symptoms. Like Dr. Whitmore, he discovered that Margaret's vital signs appeared normal despite her obvious decline in health and cognitive function. The examination revealed no evidence of tuberculosis, typhoid, or other diseases commonly associated with urban living conditions. But Dr. Blackwood began to notice that Margaret's case was not unique among his wealthy clientele. Several other households that had installed the latest sanitation systems were reporting similar mysterious health problems affecting both servants and family members. The pattern was subtle enough to escape casual observation, but systematic enough to suggest some common cause. The affected households shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from families who had not experienced these mysterious health problems. They had all invested heavily in the most advanced sewage systems available. They had all modified their buildings extensively to accommodate the new plumbing technology. Most importantly, they had all experienced these health problems only after the new systems had been installed and operating for several months. Dr. Blackwood began consulting with colleagues throughout London's medical community, hoping to determine whether other physicians were observing similar patterns among their patients. The conversations revealed a troubling trend that seemed to be affecting sanitized neighborhoods throughout the city, but the medical establishment was reluctant to acknowledge that their revolutionary public health innovations might be causing rather than preventing disease. The reluctance to question the sanitation systems was understandable given the enormous financial and political investments that had been made in these technological solutions to London's historic health problems. The sewage systems represented the culmination of decades of engineering innovation and public policy reform. Acknowledging that they might be causing harm would require admitting that the greatest public health initiative in British history was actually a catastrophic mistake. But the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore as more physicians reported mysterious health problems among residents of newly sanitized buildings. The symptoms were consistent across different neighborhoods, social classes, and age groups, suggesting some systematic cause that affected everyone exposed to the new sanitation technology. Dr. James Morrison, a physician serving London's working-class districts, had initially assumed that the health problems he was observing were related to the poor nutrition and overcrowded living conditions that had always plagued the city's labourers. But when he began documenting his cases systematically, he discovered patterns that contradicted his assumptions about poverty-related illness. The working-class families who were experiencing mysterious health problems were actually those who had benefited most from the sanitation reforms. They lived in buildings where landlords had invested in modern sewage systems as a way to attract tenants and justify higher rents. These families had better access to clean water and waste disposal than ever before in their lives. Yet they were developing symptoms that seemed completely unrelated to their improved living conditions. Children who had previously been healthy despite inadequate sanitation were becoming listless and confused after their buildings were connected to the new sewage systems. Adults who had worked physically demanding jobs for years were suddenly experiencing fatigue and weakness that made it difficult for them to maintain their employment. The mysterious decline was spreading through London's working classes, with a pattern that defied every medical theory of the time. William Henderson, a dock worker who had spent 15 years loading cargo along the Thames, exemplified the inexplicable transformation occurring throughout the city's newly sanitized districts. William had been known among his colleagues for his exceptional strength and endurance. He could work 12-hour shifts, hauling heavy crates and barrels without showing signs of fatigue that would leave younger men exhausted. His reputation for reliability had earned him steady employment even during the economic downturns that periodically swept through London's shipping industry. But within 6 months of his tenement building's connection to the revolutionary sewage system, William began experiencing a gradual but unmistakable decline in his physical capabilities. Tasks that had once been effortless became increasingly difficult. His hands, which had gripped ropes and tools with unwavering strength for decades, began to tremble during delicate operations that required precise control. The trembling started as an occasional inconvenience that William attributed to temporary fatigue or perhaps the natural effects of aging. But the condition progressed steadily until it became impossible to ignore. His fellow dockworkers began to notice that William was dropping tools and struggling to maintain his grip on cargo that he had previously handled with ease. More troubling than the physical symptoms were the cognitive changes that began to affect William's ability to perform tasks that had become second nature through years of experience. He would forget the locations of storage areas he had used daily for over a decade. He would become confused about loading procedures that he had taught to dozens of new workers. Most frightening of all, he would sometimes find himself standing in the middle of the dock with no memory of how he had gotten there or what he was supposed to be doing. William's wife, Ellen, initially attributed these changes to the stress of working in London's increasingly competitive shipping industry. The introduction of new steam-powered machinery had eliminated many traditional jobs, and she assumed that William was struggling to adapt to technological changes that were transforming the nature of dock work throughout the British Empire. But Ellen began to notice that William's problems extended far beyond workplace adjustment. At home, he was experiencing the same mysterious decline that was affecting their neighbours throughout the tenement district. He would start conversations and then lose track of his thoughts mid-sentence. He would begin simple household repairs and then abandon them half-finished, staring at familiar tools as if he had never seen them before. The Henderson family lived in a 5-story tenement building that housed over 60 families in conditions that had been dramatically improved by the installation of modern sanitation systems. The building's landlord, Samuel Worthington, had invested heavily in the new sewage technology as part of an ambitious renovation project designed to attract more prosperous tenants and justify higher rents. Worthington had marketed the building's modern sanitation as a revolutionary advancement that would eliminate the health hazards and unpleasant odors associated with traditional waste management methods. Prospective tenants were invited to tour the building's sophisticated plumbing systems and admire the gleaming pipes that promised to whisk away human waste with mechanical efficiency. The renovation had been enormously successful from a financial perspective, allowing Worthington to increase rents by nearly 50% while maintaining full occupancy. Families competed for apartments in the building, recognizing that access to modern sanitation represented a significant improvement in their quality of life compared to the primitive conditions that characterized most working-class housing. But within a year of the building's reopening, Worthington began receiving complaints from tenants that seemed completely unrelated to the sanitary improvements he had provided. Families reported that their children were becoming listless and having difficulty concentrating in school. Adults complained of persistent fatigue and confusion that made it hard to maintain their employment. Most disturbing were reports of behavioral changes that seemed to affect entire families simultaneously. The Pemberton family, who occupied a third-floor apartment directly above the Hendersons, experienced a particularly dramatic transformation that illustrated the mysterious epidemic affecting the building's residents. Robert Pemberton worked as a clerk in a shipping office, where his meticulous attention to detail had earned him steady promotions over 8 years of employment. Robert's job required him to maintain complex records of cargo shipments, customs documentation, and financial transactions that demanded absolute accuracy and careful organization. His supervisors had come to rely on his ability to manage multiple projects simultaneously, while ensuring that every detail was recorded correctly and filed appropriately. But after moving into the renovated tenement building, Robert began making errors that were completely out of character for someone with his professional reputation. He would misfile important documents, forget to complete routine tasks, and become confused about procedures he had performed flawlessly for years. His supervisors initially attributed these problems to personal distractions or perhaps romantic complications that were interfering with his professional focus. Robert's wife, Mary, was experiencing similar difficulties in managing their household responsibilities. Mary had been known throughout their previous neighborhood as an exceptionally organized woman who maintained their apartment with remarkable efficiency while caring for 3 young children. She had managed complex budgets, coordinated family schedules, and maintained social relationships with skill that other wives admired and sought to emulate. But after moving to the sanitized tenement building, Mary began struggling with basic domestic tasks that she had performed effortlessly for years. She would start preparing meals and then forget what she was cooking, leaving pots to burn on the stove while she stared blankly at ingredients she could not remember purchasing. She would begin cleaning routines and then abandon them half-finished, creating chaos and confusion that left her feeling overwhelmed and incompetent. The Pemberton children were experiencing changes that were even more disturbing than their parents' mysterious decline. 8-year-old Timothy, who had been an excellent student known for his quick mind and cheerful disposition, became withdrawn and confused after moving to the new building. His schoolteacher reported that Timothy seemed unable to concentrate on lessons that had previously engaged his interest and enthusiasm. Timothy would sit at his desk staring blankly at arithmetic problems that he had solved easily just months before. He would start reading exercises and then stop mid-sentence, apparently forgetting what he was supposed to be doing. Most concerning were episodes where Timothy would become disoriented and confused about his surroundings, asking his teacher where he was and how he had gotten there. The teacher, Miss Charlotte Williams, had initially assumed that Timothy was struggling to adjust to his family's recent move to a new neighborhood. Children often experienced temporary academic difficulties when their living situations changed, and she had seen many students overcome such challenges with patience and encouragement. But Timothy's problems seemed to be getting worse rather than better as time passed. His confusion and disorientation were becoming more frequent and more severe. He was also developing physical symptoms that had nothing to do with academic adjustment. He complained of persistent headaches, lost weight despite having access to better nutrition than ever before, and developed a cough that physicians could not explain or treat effectively. Miss Williams began to notice that Timothy was not the only student experiencing these mysterious problems. Several other children from newly sanitized buildings throughout her district were displaying similar symptoms. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable to an experienced teacher who had worked with hundreds of children over 15 years of educational service. The affected children came from different families and social backgrounds, but they all shared one common characteristic that distinguished them from classmates who remained healthy and academically successful. They all lived in buildings that had recently been connected to London's revolutionary new sewage systems. Miss Williams began documenting these observations in a private journal, hoping to identify factors that might help her understand and address the mysterious epidemic affecting her students. The journal entries revealed a troubling pattern of cognitive decline, behavioral changes, and physical symptoms that seemed to be spreading through sanitized neighborhoods throughout London. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore, but the implications were so disturbing that most observers were reluctant to acknowledge what they were witnessing. The sanitation systems represented the pinnacle of British engineering achievement and the foundation of London's transformation into a model modern city. Accepting that these innovations were causing rather than preventing disease would require abandoning fundamental assumptions about progress and public health that had guided urban development throughout the Industrial Revolution. But Dr. Whitmore, Dr. Blackwood, Dr. Morrison and other physicians throughout London were beginning to connect the pieces of a puzzle that revealed a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The symptoms they were observing among residents of sanitized buildings were not random or coincidental. They followed patterns that suggested systematic poisoning on a scale that dwarfed any previous public health disaster in British history. The physicians began meeting privately to share their observations and coordinate their investigations into what was becoming clear was the greatest medical mystery of the Victorian era. These clandestine gatherings took place in private clubs and residential parlours where medical professionals could discuss their findings without alerting public authorities or newspaper reporters who might create panic by publicising preliminary theories about the sanitation systems. The doctors understood that they were dealing with information that could destabilise London's economy and undermine public confidence in the technological innovations that had transformed the city into a showcase of modern civilization. But their professional obligations required them to investigate the mysterious epidemic, regardless of the political and economic consequences of their discoveries. Dr. Whitmore took the lead in organising these informal medical conferences, using his reputation and social connections to bring together physicians from different districts and social backgrounds who were observing similar patterns among their patients. The meetings revealed that the mysterious health problems were affecting every neighbourhood and social class that had been connected to the new sewage systems. The geographic distribution of symptoms corresponded precisely with the installation timeline of London's sanitation network. Areas that had been connected to the sewage systems earliest were experiencing the most severe and widespread health problems. Neighbourhoods that had been connected more recently were beginning to show similar symptoms, but with less severity and frequency that suggested the problems developed gradually over time. Most significantly, areas of London that had not yet been connected to the new sewage systems showed no evidence of the mysterious epidemic. Families living in buildings with traditional waste management methods remained healthy, despite the primitive and unsanitary conditions that public health authorities had identified as breeding grounds for disease and pestilence. The implications were staggering and terrifying. London's greatest triumph of engineering and public policy was systematically poisoning the entire population of the world's largest city. The very systems that were supposed to eliminate disease and create healthier living conditions were actually causing a slow-motion catastrophe that threatened to destroy the lives and minds of millions of innocent people. The evidence was mounting with each passing day, but the full scope of the disaster remained hidden from public view by a conspiracy of silence that extended from the highest levels of government to the most prestigious medical institutions. The physicians who were beginning to understand the true nature of London's sanitation crisis found themselves caught between their professional duty to protect public health and enormous pressure from authorities who desperately wanted to suppress any information that might undermine confidence in the city's revolutionary infrastructure investments. Lord Pemberton, the Minister of Public Works who had championed the sanitation reforms, received his first official report about the mysterious health problems in December of 1858. The document, prepared by Dr. Whitmore and signed by 17 other prominent physicians, detailed the systematic pattern of cognitive decline, physical deterioration, and behavioural changes affecting residents of newly sanitised buildings throughout London. The report was carefully worded to avoid inflammatory language or direct accusations against the sewage systems, but its implications were unmistakable. The physicians documented case after case of previously healthy individuals who had developed debilitating symptoms only after their buildings were connected to the new sanitation network. The correlation was too consistent and too widespread to be explained by coincidence or other factors. Lord Pemberton's response revealed the political calculations that would shape the government's handling of what was becoming the greatest public health crisis in British history. Rather than ordering immediate investigations or implementing precautionary measures to protect public health, he convened a secret committee charged with determining how to manage the information without damaging London's reputation as a model of modern urban development. The committee included senior officials from multiple government departments, representatives from the engineering firms that had designed and installed the sewage systems, and carefully selected medical experts who could be trusted to prioritize political stability over public disclosure. Their mandate was not to investigate the health problems or develop solutions to protect London's population, but to control information flow and minimize economic disruption. The committee's first decision was to classify all reports about sanitation-related health problems as state secrets that could not be discussed publicly without official authorization. Physicians who had been documenting the mysterious epidemic were warned that continued research or publication of their findings would be considered treasonous activity that threatened national security and economic stability. Dr. Whitmore received a personal visit from government officials who made it clear that his medical practice, his reputation, and his family's security depended on his cooperation with efforts to suppress information about the health problems affecting sanitized neighborhoods. The threats were subtle but unmistakable, delivered by men who possessed the authority to destroy anyone who interfered with their efforts to protect London's image as the world's most advanced city. The pressure on physicians to remain silent was accompanied by a sophisticated propaganda campaign designed to discredit any reports about sanitation-related health problems. Government-funded medical journals began publishing articles that attributed the mysterious symptoms to hysteria, seasonal changes, or psychological reactions to modern living conditions, rather than physical causes related to the sewage systems. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, who had been treating Margaret Thompson and other affected members of wealthy families, found his research funding eliminated and his access to prestigious medical conferences revoked after he attempted to present his findings at the Royal College of Physicians. His colleagues were warned that association with his theories about sanitation-related illness could damage their own careers and professional standing. The systematic suppression of medical research created an atmosphere of fear and silence that prevented physicians from sharing information or coordinating their investigations. Doctors who had been documenting similar patterns among their patients were isolated from each other, making it impossible to develop comprehensive understanding of the epidemic's scope or identify effective treatments for affected individuals. Meanwhile, the health crisis was accelerating as more neighborhoods were connected to the sewage systems, and existing connections continued to poison residents who had been exposed for longer periods. The symptoms that had initially appeared subtle and gradual were becoming more severe and more obvious as the toxic effects accumulated in people's bodies over months and years of exposure. Thomas Mitchell watched helplessly as his wife Sarah's condition deteriorated beyond anything their family physician could understand or treat. The vibrant woman who had managed their household with remarkable efficiency had become a shadow of her former self, struggling to complete simple tasks and often becoming confused about her surroundings and relationships. Sarah's memory problems had progressed to the point where she would forget the names of her own children and become frightened when they approached her. She would spend hours staring at familiar objects as if she had never seen them before, unable to remember their purposes or how to use them. Most heartbreaking were moments when she would look at Thomas with no recognition, asking who he was and what he was doing in her house. The physical symptoms were equally devastating. Sarah had lost nearly 30 pounds, despite having access to better nutrition than ever before. Her skin had taken on a greyish pallor that made her appear decades older than her actual age. The persistent cough that had begun months earlier had worsened to the point where she would have violent spasms that left her gasping for breath and spitting blood. Thomas had consulted every physician he could afford, but none could provide explanations or treatments for Sarah's mysterious decline. The doctors seemed genuinely puzzled by her symptoms, which didn't match any known diseases or conditions described in their medical training. Some suggested that she might be suffering from hysteria or feminine nervous disorders, recommendations that infuriated Thomas because they ignored the obvious severity of her physical deterioration. The Mitchell family's tragedy was being repeated throughout London's newly sanitized districts as the toxic effects of the sewage systems claimed more victims. Children who had been healthy and active were becoming listless and confused. Adults who had worked productively for decades were losing their ability to perform simple tasks. Elderly residents were experiencing accelerated decline that seemed to compress years of natural aging into months of devastating deterioration. William Henderson's condition had progressed to the point where he could no longer work at the docks. The trembling in his hands had become so severe that he couldn't grip tools or ropes safely, creating dangerous situations for himself and his fellow workers. His supervisors had initially tried to find alternative tasks that might accommodate his limitations. But his cognitive problems made it impossible for him to follow even simple instructions reliably. The loss of employment was financially devastating for the Henderson family, but the personal impact was even more destructive. William had defined himself through his work for over 15 years, taking pride in his strength and reliability as a dock worker. The mysterious illness had stripped away not just his ability to earn a living, but his sense of identity and purpose as well. Ellen Henderson found herself caring for a husband who seemed to be disappearing before her eyes. The man who had been her partner and companion for 12 years had become increasingly dependent on her for basic functions that he had performed automatically throughout their marriage. He would forget to eat unless she reminded him. He would become lost walking to locations he had visited hundreds of times. Most frightening were episodes where he would become agitated and aggressive without apparent cause, behavior that was completely unlike his gentle and patient nature. The Henderson family lived in constant fear that William's condition would continue to deteriorate until he became completely unable to care for himself. Ellen had heard whispered stories about other residents of their building who had experienced similar progressions, eventually requiring constant supervision and care that their families could not provide. The mystery deepened when Ellen began experiencing symptoms that mirrored her husband's decline. The stress of caring for William had initially seemed to explain her fatigue and occasional confusion, but the problems were becoming too consistent and too severe to be attributed to caregiver exhaustion. She was developing the same trembling hands, the same memory problems, and the same mysterious cough that had marked the beginning of William's illness. The realization that the entire Henderson family might be succumbing to the same mysterious condition was terrifying beyond description. Their 3 children were beginning to show subtle signs of the cognitive and behavioral changes that had preceded the more obvious symptoms in their parents. 8-year-old Michael was having difficulty concentrating in school. 5-year-old Emma was becoming withdrawn and listless. 2-year-old James was developing normally in some areas, but seemed to be losing skills he had already acquired. The pattern was repeating itself throughout the tenement building as more families experienced the mysterious decline that seemed to affect everyone exposed to the new sanitation systems. Samuel Worthington, the building's owner, was becoming increasingly concerned about the complaints he was receiving from tenants, but he was also terrified of acknowledging that his expensive renovations might be causing the health problems. Worthington had invested his entire fortune in the building's modernization, borrowing heavily against his other properties to finance the installation of the revolutionary sewage systems. Admitting that the improvements were actually harming his tenants would not only destroy his investment, but could also expose him to legal liability that would bankrupt his entire business empire. The landlord's response was to deny any connection between the sanitation systems and the health problems, while quietly investigating alternative explanations that might account for his tenants' mysterious symptoms. He hired private physicians to examine affected families, hoping to identify causes that had nothing to do with his building's infrastructure. Dr. Marcus Wellington, the physician retained by Worthington, was initially skeptical of claims that modern sanitation systems could cause health problems. His medical training had emphasized the benefits of improved hygiene and waste management, and he found it difficult to believe that technological advances could be responsible for the symptoms he was observing. But Dr. Wellington's examination of the tenement building's residents revealed patterns that were impossible to ignore. or explain through conventional medical understanding. The affected families shared no common characteristics other than their residence in the building and their exposure to its sanitation systems. They came from different social backgrounds, had different occupations, ate different foods, and followed different daily routines. The only factor that connected all the affected individuals was their exposure to the air, water, and waste management systems that had been installed during the building's renovation. This realization forced Dr. Wellington to consider possibilities that challenged everything he had learned about public health and disease prevention during his medical education. The physician began conducting discrete tests to determine whether the building's sanitation systems might be producing toxic substances that could account for the mysterious health problems. His investigations were complicated by the need for secrecy, as Worthington had made it clear that any findings suggesting problems with the renovations would not be welcomed or compensated. Dr. Wellington's preliminary tests revealed disturbing anomalies in the air quality within the building, particularly in areas closest to the sewage pipes and ventilation systems. The air contained chemical compounds that had not been present before the renovation, substances that could potentially explain the neurological and physical symptoms affecting the residents. But the physician faced an impossible dilemma. Publishing his findings would vindicate his scientific integrity, but would also destroy his relationship with Worthington and other wealthy clients who had invested heavily in similar sanitation projects. Remaining silent would protect his financial interests, but would condemn innocent families to continued exposure to whatever toxic conditions were causing their mysterious decline. The moral complexity of the situation was compounded by Dr. Wellington's growing realization that the problem extended far beyond a single building or landlord. His conversations with colleagues throughout London's medical community revealed that similar health problems were appearing wherever the new sanitation systems had been installed, suggesting a systematic issue that threatened the health of hundreds of thousands of people. The scope of the potential disaster was so enormous that Dr. Wellington found it difficult to believe his own conclusions. If the sanitation systems were indeed causing widespread health problems, then London's greatest achievement in public health and urban development was actually the largest accidental poisoning in human history. The implications were staggering, not just for London, but for cities throughout the British Empire and the world that were planning to implement similar sanitation technologies. If the systems that were being celebrated as the solution to urban health problems were actually creating new and more dangerous forms of illness, then the entire foundation of modern urban planning would need to be reconsidered. Dr. Wellington's investigation was interrupted by pressure from government officials who had learned about his research through their network of informants within London's medical community. The officials made it clear that continued investigation of sanitation-related health problems would be considered a threat to national security and economic stability. The physician was offered a substantial payment and a prestigious government position in exchange for his silence about his findings. The offer was accompanied by subtle but unmistakable threats about what might happen to his medical practice and his family's security if he chose to continue his research or publish his conclusions. Faced with this impossible choice, Dr. Wellington chose to protect his family and his career by accepting the government's offer and abandoning his investigation. His decision was morally complex, but understandable given the enormous pressure he was facing and the apparent futility of challenging such powerful forces alone. The silencing of Dr. Wellington was part of a broader pattern of intimidation and suppression that prevented London's medical community from developing comprehensive understanding of the sanitation crisis or implementing effective responses to protect public health. Physicians throughout the city were being pressured to ignore or misdiagnose symptoms that might be linked to the sewage systems. The conspiracy of silence was maintained through a combination of financial incentives, professional pressure, and direct threats that made it extremely dangerous for anyone to challenge the official narrative about London's sanitary achievements. The few physicians who attempted to continue their research found themselves isolated, discredited, and ultimately forced to abandon their investigations or face professional and personal destruction. Meanwhile, the health crisis continued to spread as more neighborhoods were connected to the sewage systems, and the toxic effects accumulated in people who had been exposed for extended periods. The mysterious epidemic was claiming new victims daily, while authorities worked desperately to prevent public awareness of the disaster they had inadvertently created. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the victims themselves were often unaware of the true cause of their suffering. Families experiencing the mysterious decline attributed their symptoms to bad luck, personal failings, or natural aging processes, rather than recognizing that they were being systematically poisoned by the very systems that were supposed to improve their health and quality of life. The children were perhaps the most heartbreaking victims because they had no understanding of what was happening to them or why their bodies and minds were betraying them in such frightening ways. They trusted the adults around them to protect them from harm, never imagining that the gleaming pipes and modern conveniences in their homes were slowly destroying their futures. The institutional machinery, designed to suppress the truth, was operating with terrifying efficiency, but it could not silence the growing chorus of families whose lives were being destroyed by London's revolutionary sanitation systems. In drawing rooms throughout the city, desperate parents were beginning to connect with each other, sharing stories that revealed the systematic nature of the catastrophe unfolding in their sanitized neighborhoods. Lady Catherine Ashworth had initially believed her family's troubles were an isolated misfortune when her youngest daughter, 9-year-old Penelope, began experiencing the mysterious symptoms that were becoming all too familiar throughout London's affluent districts. Penelope had been a precocious child, reading advanced literature and demonstrating mathematical abilities that impressed her private tutors and delighted her socially ambitious mother. But within months of their Mayfair mansion's connection to the revolutionary sewage network, Penelope had transformed from a bright, engaged student into a confused and frightened child who could barely complete simple arithmetic problems that had once been effortless for her. The transformation was so dramatic that Lady Ashworth initially suspected her daughter was deliberately misbehaving to gain attention or avoid her educational responsibilities. The governess, Miss Victoria Hartwell, had worked with wealthy families throughout London for over a decade, and she recognized immediately that Penelope's difficulties were not behavioral or disciplinary in nature. The child was genuinely struggling to access knowledge and skills that she had possessed just months earlier, as if some invisible force was systematically erasing her intellectual capabilities. Miss Hartwell began documenting Penelope's decline in her private journal, hoping to identify patterns that might help her understand and address whatever was affecting her student. The entries revealed a progression of symptoms that started with subtle memory lapses and gradually developed into severe cognitive impairment that made formal education increasingly impossible. The governess noticed that Penelope would forget the meanings of words she had used confidently for years. She would start reading passages from familiar books and then stop mid-sentence, staring at the pages as if the letters had become incomprehensible symbols. Most disturbing were moments when Penelope would look at Miss Hartwell with complete bewilderment, apparently unable to recognize someone who had been part of her daily routine for 3 years. Lady Ashworth's initial irritation with her daughter's academic performance transformed into genuine terror as she realized that Penelope's problems were accompanied by physical symptoms that no amount of discipline or tutoring could address. The child was losing weight, despite having access to the finest foods prepared by experienced household cooks. Her skin was developing an unhealthy pallor that cosmetics and fresh air could not improve. Most frightening was the persistent cough that began as a minor irritation, but gradually intensified into violent spasms that left Penelope gasping for breath. The Ashworth family consulted London's most prestigious physicians, sparing no expense in their desperate search for explanations and treatments for Penelope's mysterious decline. Dr. Reginald Blackstone, whose practice served the royal family, and other members of the highest social circles, examined Penelope thoroughly but found himself unable to identify any specific disease or condition that could account for her symptoms. Dr. Blackstone's examination revealed no evidence of tuberculosis, typhoid, or other diseases commonly associated with childhood illness in Victorian England. Penelope's vital signs appeared normal despite her obvious deterioration, creating a medical puzzle that challenged everything the distinguished physician understood about disease and diagnosis. But Dr. Blackstone was beginning to notice disturbing patterns among his wealthy clientele that suggested Penelope's case was not an isolated medical mystery. Several other prominent families were consulting him about similar symptoms affecting their children, and the affected households shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from families who remained healthy. The Pemberton family, whose estate neighboured the Ashworth property, was experiencing nearly identical problems with their twin sons, Edward and Charles. The boys had been exceptional students known throughout their social circle for their academic achievements and athletic abilities. They had competed successfully in rowing, cricket, and academic competitions that brought honour to their family name and social standing. But after their family mansion was connected to the new sewage systems, both boys began experiencing cognitive and physical decline that made their previous accomplishments seem like memories from another lifetime. Edward, who had been captain of his school's debate team, found himself unable to complete coherent sentences during what should have been routine discussions. Charles, who had excelled in mathematics and natural sciences, could no longer perform basic calculations that he had mastered years earlier. The Pemberton parents, Lord and Lady Pemberton, initially attributed their son's difficulties to the natural challenges of adolescence and the pressures of preparing for university examinations. They arranged for additional tutoring and implemented stricter study schedules, assuming that discipline and hard work would restore their children's academic performance to previous levels. But the boys' problems were clearly beyond anything that educational intervention could address. They were experiencing memory loss, confusion, and disorientation that affected every aspect of their daily lives. They would forget the names of servants they had known since childhood. They would become lost in their own home, unable to find rooms they had visited thousands of times. Most disturbing were episodes where they would stare blankly at their parents, apparently unable to recognize the people who had raised them from infancy. The physical symptoms were equally alarming. Both boys were losing weight rapidly, despite having access to nutritious meals prepared by skilled kitchen staff. Their complexions had become sallow and unhealthy, giving them an aged appearance that was shocking in children who had previously radiated youth and vitality. The persistent coughs that both boys developed were accompanied by chest pains and breathing difficulties that made physical activities increasingly impossible. Lord Pemberton, who held a senior position in the government department responsible for London's sanitation reforms, found himself confronting a personal crisis that challenged everything he believed about progress and public health. His professional reputation was built on championing the technological innovations that had transformed London into a model of modern urban development. But his own children were apparently being destroyed by those same innovations. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Lord Pemberton had spent years promoting sanitation systems as the solution to London's historic health problems, arguing in Parliament and public forums that modern sewage technology would eliminate the diseases and social problems that had plagued urban populations for centuries. But his own family was experiencing health problems that seemed directly connected to the very systems he had championed. The personal dimension of the crisis forced Lord Pemberton to begin questioning assumptions he had never thought to examine. If the sanitation systems were indeed causing health problems, then his professional legacy was built on a foundation of systematic harm to innocent families throughout London. The implications were so devastating that he found it almost impossible to acknowledge them, even in his private thoughts. But the evidence in his own household was becoming impossible to ignore. His wife, Lady Pemberton, was also beginning to show symptoms that mirrored their son's mysterious decline. She was experiencing memory problems, confusion, and physical deterioration that could not be attributed to natural aging or emotional stress related to her children's illness. Lady Pemberton had been known throughout London society for her intellectual sophistication and social grace. She had managed complex household arrangements, coordinated elaborate social events, and maintained relationships with hundreds of influential families throughout the British Empire. Her abilities as a hostess and social organizer had been essential to her husband's political career and their family's social standing. But Lady Pemberton was finding it increasingly difficult to perform tasks that had once been effortless for her. She would forget the names of longtime friends and social acquaintances. She would become confused about appointments and social obligations that she had managed successfully for decades. Most embarrassing were moments during social gatherings when she would lose track of conversations mid-sentence, staring blankly at guests who expected her to maintain the sophisticated discourse that had made her famous throughout London society. The Pemberton family's private crisis was being repeated throughout London's most prestigious neighbourhoods as the toxic effects of the sanitation systems claimed victims from every social class and background. Wealthy families who had invested heavily in modern conveniences found themselves trapped in a nightmare that their money and influence could not resolve. The Earl of Worthington, whose family had occupied their Belgravia mansion for generations, watched helplessly as his entire household succumbed to the mysterious epidemic that was sweeping through sanitized districts. The Earl himself was experiencing cognitive decline that made it increasingly difficult for him to manage the complex financial and legal affairs that required his personal attention as the head of one of England's oldest aristocratic families. The Earl's memory problems were affecting his ability to recognize family members, business associates, and longtime servants who had been part of his daily routine for decades. He would forget important appointments, lose track of financial documents, and become confused about legal matters that required his immediate attention. His lawyers and business managers were beginning to notice that their communications with him were becoming increasingly difficult and unproductive. The Countess of Worthington was experiencing similar symptoms that were destroying her ability to fulfill the social obligations expected of someone in her position. She had been responsible for coordinating charitable activities, managing household staff, and maintaining relationships with other aristocratic families throughout the British Empire. But her declining cognitive abilities were making it impossible to perform these functions effectively. The Countess would forget the details of charitable commitments she had made, creating embarrassing situations when beneficiaries arrived, expecting donations or support that she could not remember promising. She would give contradictory instructions to household servants, creating confusion and inefficiency that undermined the smooth operation of their estate. Most troubling were social situations where she would fail to recognize people she had known for years, violating the complex protocols that governed aristocratic interaction. The Worthington children were experiencing the same devastating decline that was affecting young people throughout London's sanitized neighborhoods. 15-year-old Lord Pemberton, the family's heir, had been preparing for university education that would prepare him for eventual leadership of the family's vast business and political interests. But his academic performance had deteriorated to the point where his tutors were beginning to question whether he possessed the intellectual capabilities necessary for higher education. The boy who had once demonstrated exceptional abilities in languages, mathematics, and natural sciences could barely complete basic exercises that should have been appropriate for students half his age. His memory problems made it impossible for him to retain information from one lesson to the next. His attention span had become so limited that he could not focus on reading assignments for more than a few minutes at a time. 12-year-old Lady Victoria was experiencing equally dramatic decline that was destroying her prospects for the advantageous marriage that would be essential for maintaining her family's social position. Victorian society expected young women of her class to demonstrate accomplishments in music, languages, and social graces that would make them attractive to wealthy suitors from other aristocratic families. But Lady Victoria's mysterious illness was eliminating her ability to develop or maintain these essential skills. She could no longer remember pieces of music she had played successfully for years. Her conversational abilities in French and Italian, which had been sources of family pride, had deteriorated to the point where she could barely construct simple sentences. Most concerning were changes in her personality and behavior that made her increasingly inappropriate for the refined social interactions that would be necessary for her future success. The Worthington family's crisis illustrated the way the sanitation disaster was threatening the very foundations of British society by destroying the capabilities of individuals who were expected to provide leadership and continuity for important institutions. If the epidemic continued to spread through London's elite families, it could undermine the social and political structures that had maintained stability throughout the British Empire. Similar scenarios were unfolding in middle-class households throughout London as families who had invested their savings in modern conveniences found themselves confronting health problems that threatened their economic security and social standing. Professional men who depended on their intellectual capabilities for their livelihoods were experiencing cognitive decline that made it impossible to continue their careers. Mr. Jonathan Blackwell, a successful barrister whose legal practice served wealthy clients throughout London, began experiencing memory problems that were destroying his ability to represent his clients effectively in court proceedings. Blackwell had built his reputation on his exceptional ability to remember complex legal precedents, manage multiple cases simultaneously, and present compelling arguments that swayed judges and juries in favor of his clients. But after his family's townhouse was connected to the new sewage system, Blackwell found himself unable to access the knowledge and skills that had made him one of London's most successful legal practitioners. He would forget important case details during court appearances, creating embarrassing situations that damaged his professional credibility. He would lose track of legal documents and miss crucial deadlines that could determine the outcomes of expensive litigation. Blackwell's clients began to notice his declining performance and started transferring their business to other barristers who could provide more reliable representation. The loss of income was financially devastating for his family, but the damage to his professional reputation was even more serious because it would be difficult to rebuild his practice, even if his health problems were eventually resolved. Mrs. Elizabeth Blackwell was experiencing her own version of the mysterious decline that was affecting families throughout their neighborhood. Elizabeth had managed their household finances with remarkable skill, maintaining detailed records of expenses and investments that enabled their family to live comfortably on her husband's variable income from his legal practice. But Elizabeth's cognitive problems were making it impossible for her to continue managing their complex financial arrangements. She would forget to pay bills, lose track of important documents, and make purchasing decisions that created unnecessary expenses their reduced income could not support. The combination of Jonathan's declining earnings and Elizabeth's inability to manage their household budget was creating financial pressures that threatened their middle-class lifestyle. The Blackwell children were experiencing educational difficulties that threatened their prospects for professional careers that would maintain their family's social position. 14-year-old James, who had been an exceptional student preparing for university education, was struggling with academic work that had previously been effortless for him. His teachers reported that he seemed unable to concentrate on lessons or retain information from one class session to the next. 11-year-old Mary was experiencing similar problems that were affecting her preparation for the social roles expected of young women in middle-class families. She was having difficulty with music lessons, needlework, and other accomplishments that would be necessary for attracting a suitable husband from a respectable family. Her personality changes were also concerning, as she was becoming withdrawn and anxious in social situations that had previously brought her pleasure. The pattern of family-wide decline was repeating itself throughout London's middle-class districts, as the toxic effects of the sanitation systems destroyed the capabilities that enabled families to maintain their economic and social positions. Professional men found themselves unable to continue their careers. Women lost the skills necessary for managing complex households. Children experienced educational failures that eliminated their prospects for advancement. The cumulative effect was a systematic destruction of London's social fabric, as families throughout the city lost the abilities that had enabled them to contribute productively to their communities and maintain the complex relationships that held Victorian society together. The disaster was particularly devastating because it affected entire households simultaneously, eliminating the family support systems that might have helped individual members cope with health problems. Dr. Whitmore continued his clandestine documentation of the epidemic, despite increasing pressure from government officials who wanted to suppress any information about sanitation-related health problems. His private records revealed patterns of decline that were affecting hundreds of families throughout London's newly sanitized districts, creating a picture of systematic poisoning on a scale that dwarfed any previous public health disaster in human history. The physician's investigation had identified specific chemical compounds in the air and water of sanitized buildings that could potentially explain the neurological and physical symptoms affecting residents. These substances had not been present before the sewage systems were installed, and their concentrations seemed to correlate with the severity of health problems experienced by different families. But Dr. Whitmore faced the same impossible dilemma that was confronting other physicians throughout London's medical community. Publishing his findings would serve the cause of medical science and public health, but it would also expose him to retaliation from powerful interests who were determined to protect their investments in sanitation technology. The pressure to remain silent was intensifying as government officials became aware of his continued research activities. Dr. Whitmore received increasingly direct threats about the consequences of continuing his investigation or sharing his findings with other physicians or members of the public. The threats were accompanied by offers of financial compensation and prestigious appointments that would provide him with economic security in exchange for his cooperation with efforts to suppress information about the sanitation crisis. The offers were tempting because Dr. Whitmore's medical practice was suffering as patients became suspicious of physicians who might be connected to theories about sanitation-related illness. The physician found himself caught between his professional obligation to protect public health and the practical necessity of protecting his family's economic security and personal safety. The moral complexity of the situation was compounded by his growing realization that individual resistance to such powerful forces was likely to be futile and personally destructive. Dr. Whitmore's internal struggle reflected the broader moral crisis confronting everyone who understood the true nature of London's sanitation disaster. The evidence was becoming overwhelming that the city's greatest technological achievement was actually a systematic poisoning of its entire population. But acknowledging this reality would require challenging institutions and interests that possessed the power to destroy anyone who threatened their investments and reputations. The conspiracy of silence was maintained through a combination of financial incentives, professional pressure, and direct intimidation that made it extremely dangerous for anyone to speak publicly about what they were witnessing. Physicians, government officials, and even ordinary citizens who attempted to discuss the health problems were quickly silenced through methods that left no doubt about the consequences of continued resistance. Meanwhile, the health crisis continued to accelerate as more neighborhoods were connected to the sewage systems and the toxic effects accumulated in people who had been exposed for extended periods. The mysterious epidemic was claiming new victims daily, while authorities worked desperately to prevent public awareness of the disaster they had created through their well-intentioned but catastrophically flawed approach to urban sanitation. The tragedy was deepened by the realization that the victims of this disaster were precisely the people who had supported and celebrated London's transformation into a model of modern civilization. The families experiencing the mysterious decline had been the most enthusiastic advocates for technological progress and urban reform. They had invested their money, their hopes, and their faith in innovations that promised to create healthier and more prosperous lives for themselves and their children. Their trust in progress and expertise had made them willing participants in an experiment that was systematically destroying everything they had worked to achieve. The irony was cruel beyond description. The very people who had embraced modernity most completely were becoming its most tragic victims. their bodies and minds sacrificed to demonstrate the devastating consequences of unquestioned faith in technological solutions to complex social problems. The children, who were suffering the most severe effects of the sanitation disaster, had no understanding of the forces that were destroying their futures. They trusted the adults around them to protect them from harm, never imagining that their parents' commitment to providing them with modern conveniences would expose them to dangers far greater than anything they might have faced in the primitive conditions that the sewage systems were designed to eliminate. The scope of the disaster was becoming impossible to conceal as winter deepened into the early months of 1859. What had begun as isolated cases of mysterious illness was transforming into a systematic epidemic that threatened the very foundation of London's social order. Yet the most chilling aspect of the crisis was not its scale, but the methodical precision with which it was being covered up by the very authorities entrusted to protect public welfare. Inspector Charles Morrison of the Metropolitan Police had noticed troubling patterns in the reports crossing his desk throughout the winter months. Missing persons cases were increasing dramatically in neighborhoods that had been recently connected to the sewage systems. Families were simply disappearing from their homes, leaving behind personal belongings and unpaid rent that suggested sudden and unexpected departures. Morrison's initial assumption was that these disappearances reflected normal population movement as families relocated to seek better opportunities or escape financial difficulties. London's rapid growth and economic volatility created constant flux in residential patterns, making it difficult to distinguish between ordinary migration and unusual demographic changes. But the inspector began to notice that the missing families shared characteristics that distinguished them from typical cases of voluntary relocation. They had left behind valuable possessions that desperate people would normally sell before abandoning their homes. Their disappearances often occurred in the middle of rental periods, forfeiting deposits and advance payments that financially struggling families could not afford to waste. Most significantly, neighbours reported that the missing families had been experiencing health problems in the weeks before their disappearances. The symptoms described by witnesses matched the mysterious illness that physicians throughout London were observing, but forbidden to discuss publicly. The pattern suggested that families might be fleeing the city to escape conditions that were making them progressively sicker. Morrison's investigation was complicated by interference from senior officials who discouraged detailed inquiry into the disappearances. The inspector received instructions to classify these cases as routine matters that did not require extensive investigation or public reporting. The directives came from levels of authority that made it clear his career prospects depended on compliance with efforts to minimize attention to these demographic anomalies. The pressure to suppress investigation extended beyond individual cases to encompass broader patterns that might reveal the systematic nature of the health crisis affecting sanitized neighborhoods. Police reports that documented correlations between sewage system installation and population changes were classified as confidential documents that could not be accessed without special authorization. But Morrison's professional instincts told him that something far more serious was occurring than ordinary population movement or even isolated health problems. The disappearances were too numerous and too concentrated in specific geographic areas to be explained by coincidence or normal demographic trends. The pattern suggested coordinated efforts to remove affected families from public view before their conditions could attract attention or investigation. The inspector's suspicions were confirmed when he discovered that several missing families had been quietly relocated to remote facilities outside London, where they could receive medical treatment away from public observation. The facilities were operated by private organisations that received government funding, but maintained strict secrecy about their patients and treatment methods. Dr. Margaret Thornfield had been recruited to oversee one of these remote treatment facilities, after her attempts to study sanitation-related illness had made her position in London's medical establishment untenable. The facility, located in a converted estate in the Yorkshire countryside, housed over 200 patients who had been transferred from London under circumstances that their families often did not fully understand. The patients represented a cross-section of London's population, from wealthy aristocrats to working-class labourers, united only by their exposure to the new sewage systems and their subsequent development of mysterious symptoms. The diversity of social backgrounds among the affected individuals provided powerful evidence that the health crisis was not related to poverty, poor nutrition, or inadequate medical care. Dr. Thornfield's examination of these patients revealed the full horror of what the sanitation systems were doing to human beings exposed to their toxic effects. The symptoms she observed were far more severe than anything she had documented during her earlier research in London, suggesting that the illness progressed relentlessly when left untreated or when exposure continued over extended periods. The neurological deterioration was particularly devastating. Patients who had been intellectually sophisticated adults just months earlier were exhibiting cognitive impairment that resembled advanced dementia or severe mental illness. They could not recognize family members, remember their own names, or perform basic tasks necessary for independent living. The physical symptoms were equally alarming. Patients were experiencing rapid weight loss that left them emaciated despite access to nutritious food. Their skin developed lesions and discoloration that suggested systematic poisoning affecting multiple organ systems. The respiratory problems that many patients experienced were so severe that some required constant medical supervision to prevent suffocation. Most disturbing was the progression of symptoms that seemed to follow predictable patterns regardless of the patient's age, social background, or previous health status. The illness appeared to attack the nervous system systematically, destroying cognitive functions in a sequence that began with memory problems and advanced through personality changes, motor control difficulties, and eventually complete incapacitation. Dr. Thornfield documented these patterns in detailed medical records that she hoped might eventually contribute to understanding and treating the mysterious illness. But her research was conducted under strict supervision by government officials who controlled access to the patients and determined what information could be recorded or shared with other medical professionals. The facility operated under conditions of absolute secrecy that prevented any outside observation or independent verification of the treatment methods being employed. Families who had been separated from affected relatives were told that their loved ones were receiving specialized medical care that required isolation from external contacts that might interfere with the healing process. The isolation was justified through medical theories about nervous disorders and infectious diseases that required patients to be protected from environmental factors that might worsen their conditions. These explanations satisfied most family members who were desperate to believe that effective treatment was available and that their relatives would eventually recover and return home. But Dr. Thornfield gradually realized that the facility was not primarily designed to treat patients, but rather to conceal them from public view, while documenting the progression of their illness for research purposes that she was not authorized to understand. The patients were essentially being used as subjects in a systematic study of the toxic effects of London's sanitation systems. The research being conducted at the facility was coordinated by Dr. Harrison Blackwood, who had been recruited by government officials after his earlier attempts to investigate sanitation-related illness had made his position in London untenable. Dr. Blackwood had accepted the assignment reluctantly, recognizing that it represented his only opportunity to continue medical research, while maintaining his professional standing and financial security. The studies being conducted under Dr. Blackwood's supervision were methodical and comprehensive, designed to document every aspect of the illness from initial symptoms through final outcomes. The patients were subjected to regular examinations that measured cognitive function, physical deterioration, and behavioral changes with scientific precision that would have been impossible to achieve in normal clinical settings. The data being collected was intended to provide definitive evidence about the toxic effects of the sanitation systems, while also identifying potential treatments or interventions that might be effective in managing the illness. But the research was conducted without the patient's informed consent and often involved procedures that caused additional suffering for people who were already experiencing devastating health problems. Dr. Blackwood found himself caught between his scientific curiosity about the mysterious illness and his growing horror at the systematic exploitation of vulnerable patients who had no understanding of how they were being used. The moral complexity of his situation was compounded by his recognition that the research might eventually lead to treatments that could help other victims of the sanitation crisis. The preliminary findings from the facility's research confirmed Dr. Thornfield's earlier observations about the toxic compounds present in London's sanitised buildings. The patient's symptoms were consistent with chronic exposure to specific chemical substances that attack the nervous system and other vital organs through mechanisms that were still not fully understood. The chemical analysis revealed that the sewage systems were producing gases and contaminating water supplies with compounds that had not been anticipated by the engineers who designed the sanitation networks. The interactions between human waste, the iron pipes, and various chemical treatments being used to manage odours and bacterial growth were creating toxic byproducts that accumulated in the air and water of sanitised buildings. The concentrations of these toxic substances were relatively low, which explained why the health effects developed gradually over months or years of exposure, rather than causing immediate poisoning that would have been obvious to residents and physicians. But the cumulative effects were devastating, causing irreversible damage to the nervous system and other organs that eventually resulted in complete incapacitation or death. The research findings provided clear evidence that London's sanitation systems were systematically poisoning their users. But this information was classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. The data could not be published, shared with other researchers, or used to develop public health interventions that might protect the population from continued exposure. Dr. Blackwood's reports were sent directly to a secret committee within the government that was responsible for managing the sanitation crisis without acknowledging its existence publicly. The committee included senior officials from multiple departments, representatives from the engineering firms that had designed the sewage systems, and carefully selected experts who could be trusted to prioritize political stability over public health concerns. The committee's deliberations focused on damage control rather than problem solving. Their primary concern was preventing public awareness of the health crisis, while minimizing the financial and political costs of acknowledging that London's greatest technological achievement was actually a systematic disaster that threatened the health of the entire population. The options available to the committee were limited by the enormous investments that had been made in the sanitation systems and the international reputation that London had developed as a model of modern urban development. Admitting that the sewage systems were causing widespread illness would destroy confidence in British engineering expertise and undermine London's position as the world's leading commercial and financial centre. The committee's solution was to continue the systematic removal of affected families from public view, while implementing gradual modifications to the sewage systems that might reduce their toxic effects without acknowledging that problems existed. The modifications were presented as routine maintenance and improvement projects, rather than emergency interventions to address public health threats. The engineering modifications were overseen by Sir William Hartwell, the chief architect of London's sanitation network, who had been secretly investigating the toxic effects of his own designs since the first reports of health problems had reached government officials. Hartwell's investigation had confirmed that the chemical interactions occurring within the sewage systems were producing compounds that had not been anticipated during the original design process. The engineers' attempts to modify the systems were hampered by the need for secrecy and the enormous complexity of the infrastructure that had been installed throughout London. The sewage network included thousands of miles of pipes, hundreds of pumping stations, and complex treatment facilities that were interconnected in ways that made it impossible to implement changes without affecting the entire system. The modifications that Hartwell was able to implement provided some reduction in the toxic compounds being produced, but they could not eliminate the fundamental problems created by the original design, without completely replacing the entire sanitation network. Such a massive reconstruction project would be financially impossible and would require acknowledging the systematic failure of the original systems. The partial modifications created new problems as they disrupted the carefully calibrated balance of chemical and mechanical processes that kept the sewage systems functioning. Some neighborhoods experienced temporary improvements in air quality and water contamination, but others saw their conditions worsen as the modifications redirected toxic compounds to different parts of the network. The uneven effects of the modifications created additional challenges for the cover-up efforts, as some families began to recover partially, while others experienced accelerated decline. The variations made it more difficult to maintain the fiction that the health problems were caused by factors unrelated to the sanitation systems, as the improvements and deteriorations seemed to correspond directly with the engineering changes being implemented. Sir William Hartwell found himself in an impossible position as he struggled to address the technical problems caused by his original designs while maintaining secrecy about the scope and nature of the crisis. His reputation as Britain's leading sanitation engineer was based on the revolutionary systems that were now revealed to be systematically poisoning London's population. But acknowledging the problems would destroy not only his professional legacy, but also the entire foundation of modern urban planning. The engineer's private correspondence with government officials revealed his growing desperation as he realized that the problems with the sewage systems were far more serious than he had initially understood. The toxic effects were not limited to specific neighborhoods or building types, but were systematic consequences of the fundamental design principles that governed the entire sanitation network. The chemical processes that created the toxic compounds were inherent to the operation of the sewage systems and could not be eliminated without completely abandoning the technological approach that had been implemented throughout London. The scale of the required changes would essentially mean admitting that the entire sanitation program had been a catastrophic mistake that had transformed London's greatest achievement into its most devastating disaster. The psychological pressure on Hartwell was enormous as he confronted the realization that his life's work had become a systematic attack on the health and lives of innocent families throughout London. The engineer had entered his profession with genuine desire to improve urban living conditions and eliminate the diseases and social problems associated with primitive sanitation methods. The irony of the situation was devastating. Hartwell's innovations had indeed eliminated many of the traditional health hazards associated with urban waste management, but they had replaced those familiar problems with new and far more dangerous threats that were invisible to the people being poisoned. The sewage systems had traded obvious and manageable risks for hidden and catastrophic dangers that were systematically destroying the mental and physical capabilities of everyone exposed to them. The engineers' attempts to develop solutions were hampered not only by technical constraints, but also by the political and economic pressures that limited the resources available for addressing the crisis. The government officials overseeing the cover-up were more concerned with preventing public awareness of the problems than with implementing effective solutions that might protect the population from continued harm. The committee responsible for managing the crisis was dominated by individuals whose primary expertise was in political damage control rather than public health or engineering. Their decisions reflected priorities that emphasized short-term stability over long-term solutions, creating conditions that allowed the health crisis to continue while preventing the public disclosure that might have generated pressure for more comprehensive interventions. The systematic suppression of information about the sanitation crisis created a moral environment where individual conscience was subordinated to institutional interests that prioritized reputation and financial considerations over human welfare. Physicians, engineers, and government officials who understood the scope of the disaster found themselves participating in a conspiracy of silence that condemned innocent families to continued suffering while protecting the investments and reputations of powerful interests. The winter of 1859 became known among the secret committee members as the season of impossible choices, as the health crisis reached proportions that made continued concealment increasingly difficult, while the political and economic consequences of public disclosure became more catastrophic. with each passing month. The toxic effects of the sanitation systems were claiming new victims daily, while the infrastructure of deception and suppression grew more elaborate and more vulnerable to exposure. Dr. Thornfield's work at the Yorkshire facility had documented over 300 cases of severe neurological and physical deterioration directly attributable to exposure to London's sewage systems. Her medical records provided comprehensive evidence of systematic poisoning on a scale that dwarfed any previous public health disaster in human history, but this evidence was locked away in government archives that could not be accessed without the highest levels of official authorization. The patients at the facility represented only a small fraction of the total number of London residents who were experiencing health problems related to the sanitation systems. Dr. Thornfield estimated that thousands of additional families throughout the city were suffering from various stages of the same mysterious illness, but most were being treated by physicians who had been pressured to misdiagnose their symptoms or attribute them to causes unrelated to the sewage systems. The scale of the cover-up required the cooperation of hundreds of physicians, government officials, and other professionals who possessed knowledge about the health crisis, but were prevented from acting on that knowledge by a combination of financial incentives, professional pressure, and direct threats. The conspiracy of silence had become a massive institutional structure that consumed enormous resources, while serving no purpose other than protecting the reputations and investments of those responsible for creating the disaster. The human cost of maintaining this conspiracy was becoming unbearable for many of the individuals forced to participate in it. Physicians found themselves violating their professional obligations to protect public health. Government officials discovered that their duty to serve the public interest conflicted with their instructions to suppress information about systematic threats to public welfare. Even the families affected by the illness were often complicit in their own deception, preferring to believe official explanations rather than confronting the terrifying reality that their trust in progress and expertise had made them victims of an unprecedented disaster. The psychological mechanisms that enabled this mass self-deception were as complex as the engineering systems that had created the physical crisis. People desperately wanted to believe that the technological innovations they had celebrated and invested in were beneficial rather than harmful. Accepting the truth about the sanitation systems would require acknowledging that their faith in progress had been misplaced, and that the very improvements they had thought would protect their families were actually destroying them. The children who were suffering the most severe effects of the toxic exposure had become symbols of everything that was wrong with the entire enterprise of urban modernization. Their innocent trust in the adults responsible for their welfare had made them the most vulnerable victims of a systematic failure that revealed the dangers of unquestioned faith in technological solutions to complex social problems. The tragedy of these young victims was compounded by their families' desperate attempts to maintain hope that effective treatment might still be possible. Parents clung to medical explanations that offered possibilities for recovery, while refusing to acknowledge evidence that suggested their children's conditions were irreversible consequences of exposure to environmental toxins that would continue to cause harm as long as they remained in sanitized buildings. The spring of 1859 brought new challenges as the warming weather created conditions that intensified the chemical reactions occurring within the sewage systems. The toxic compounds that had been relatively stable during the winter months began to volatilize more readily, increasing the concentrations in the air of sanitized buildings and accelerating the rate at which residents developed symptoms. The seasonal worsening of conditions made it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that the health problems were unrelated to the sanitation systems. Families who had experienced gradual decline during the winter months were suddenly confronting rapid deterioration that could not be explained through medical theories about natural disease progression or psychological disorders. Dr. Whitmore, who had continued his clandestine documentation of the epidemic despite increasing pressure from government officials, recorded a dramatic spike in severe symptoms during the early spring months. His private patient records revealed that families throughout London's sanitized districts were experiencing accelerated cognitive decline, more frequent respiratory crises, and new types of physical symptoms that suggested the toxic compounds were affecting additional organ systems as their concentrations increased. The seasonal intensification of the crisis created new urgency for the government officials responsible for managing the cover-up. The increase in severe symptoms was making it more likely that physicians, family members, or other observers would recognize the systematic nature of the health problems and begin asking questions that could expose the entire conspiracy. The committee overseeing the crisis response implemented additional measures designed to prevent public awareness of the worsening conditions. Medical facilities throughout London received new instructions about reporting procedures for patients with symptoms that might be related to environmental factors. Physicians were required to obtain special authorization before conducting tests or investigations that might reveal evidence of toxic exposure. The restrictions on medical investigation were accompanied by increased surveillance of physicians and other professionals who had access to information about the health crisis. Government agents monitored medical conferences, professional correspondence, and private conversations to identify individuals who might be sharing unauthorized information about sanitation-related illness. The atmosphere of surveillance and suppression created a climate of fear throughout London's medical and scientific communities. Researchers who had built their careers on open inquiry and collaboration found themselves working in conditions that resembled police states more than centers of learning and healing. The systematic suppression of scientific investigation represented an attack on the very foundations of rational inquiry that had made London's technological achievements possible. The irony was profound and tragic, and the same commitment to scientific progress that had enabled the creation of London's revolutionary sanitation systems was being systematically destroyed by efforts to conceal the catastrophic failure of those systems. The cover-up was consuming the intellectual and moral resources that would be necessary for developing genuine solutions to the crisis while perpetuating conditions that continued to cause harm to innocent victims throughout the city. As spring progressed towards summer, the toxic effects of London's sanitation systems continued to claim new victims, while the elaborate machinery of deception and suppression grew more desperate and more vulnerable to the exposure that would eventually reveal the full scope of humanity's most well-intentioned disaster. The children whose futures were being sacrificed to protect institutional reputations had become unwitting symbols of the price that societies pay when technological innovation proceeds without adequate consideration of unintended consequences or systematic accountability for harmful outcomes. The systems that had been designed to save London from the primitive conditions of the past had instead created a hidden catastrophe that would eventually dwarf the very problems they were meant to solve. The gleaming pipes and revolutionary engineering that had once symbolized human progress had become instruments of systematic destruction, proving that even the most sophisticated technologies could become weapons against the very people they were designed to protect. The very people they were designed to protect. The devastating irony of London's sanitation crisis deepened as summer approached, bringing with it atmospheric conditions that would transform an already catastrophic situation into something approaching apocalyptic proportions. The warm, humid air of June and July created perfect conditions for the chemical reactions occurring within the sewage systems to reach new levels of toxicity that exceeded even Dr. Thornfield's most pessimistic projections. The meteorological factors that intensified the crisis were as predictable as they were horrifying. Rising temperatures accelerated the decomposition processes within the sewage networks, while increased humidity enhanced the volatility of the toxic compounds being produced. The very weather patterns that had once brought relief and renewal to London's population now served to concentrate and distribute poisons throughout the city's sanitized districts with deadly efficiency. Dr. Edmund Whitmore's clandestine observations during this period documented a transformation in the nature of the epidemic that suggested the toxic effects were entering an entirely new phase of development. The symptoms he recorded were no longer limited to the gradual cognitive decline and physical deterioration that had characterized the winter months. Instead, patients were experiencing acute episodes of neurological crisis that could incapacitate previously functional individuals within hours or days. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, whose gradual decline had exemplified the mysterious illness during its earlier phases, experienced her first severe neurological episode on a sweltering afternoon in mid-June. The attack began with violent convulsions that left her unconscious on her kitchen floor, where her youngest daughter found her hours later in a pool of blood from injuries sustained during the seizure. When Sarah regained consciousness, she had lost virtually all recognition of her family members and surroundings. The woman who had once managed a complex household with remarkable efficiency could no longer remember her own name or understand the purpose of familiar objects that surrounded her. Her speech had been reduced to incoherent fragments that suggested massive damage to the language centers of her brain. Thomas Mitchell summoned Dr. Whitmore immediately, but the physician found himself confronting symptoms that exceeded anything in his medical experience. Sarah's condition represented a quantum leap in severity from the gradual decline he had been documenting, suggesting that prolonged exposure to the toxic compounds had reached some critical threshold that triggered catastrophic neurological damage. The acute phase of Sarah's illness was accompanied by physical symptoms that indicated systematic organ failure affecting multiple biological systems simultaneously. Her breathing became labored and irregular, suggesting damage to the respiratory control centers in her brain. Her heart rate fluctuated wildly between periods of dangerous acceleration and near-stopping slowness. Most ominously, her kidneys appeared to be failing as her body struggled to process the accumulated toxins that had been building in her system for over a year. Dr. Whitmore realized that Sarah's crisis represented not just individual medical emergency, but a preview of what awaited thousands of other London residents whose exposure to the sanitation systems had reached similar levels of accumulation. The acute episodes were not random medical events, but predictable consequences of chronic poisoning that would eventually affect everyone who remained in sanitized buildings for extended periods. The physician's attempts to treat Sarah were hampered by his lack of understanding about the specific toxic compounds causing her symptoms. The treatments available in Victorian medicine were designed to address known diseases and poisons, not the novel chemical combinations being produced by the interaction of human waste with the iron pipes and chemical additives used in the sewage systems. The experimental treatments that Dr. Whitmore attempted provided temporary relief for some symptoms, but seemed to accelerate the progression of others. Medications that reduced Sarah's seizures appeared to worsen her cognitive impairment. Interventions that improved her breathing created new cardiac complications. The interconnected nature of her neurological damage meant that addressing one aspect of her condition often destabilized other systems that were barely maintaining minimal function. Thomas Mitchell watched helplessly as his wife of 15 years disappeared before his eyes, not through death, but through the systematic destruction of everything that had made her the person he had loved and married. The woman lying in their bed bore Sarah's physical appearance, but possessed none of her memories, personality, or capabilities. She had become a stranger inhabiting his wife's body, a living monument to the devastating power of London's revolutionary sanitation systems. The Mitchell children were experiencing their own accelerated decline as the summer heat intensified the toxic conditions in their home. 8-year-old Mary, who had shown early signs of the mysterious illness during the spring, began having seizures similar to those that had incapacitated her mother. The child who had once been bright and engaging became withdrawn and confused, unable to recognize her own siblings or remember basic information about her daily routine. 6-year-old James was developing motor control problems that made it increasingly difficult for him to walk, feed himself, or perform other basic functions necessary for independent existence. The boy would attempt to climb stairs and find himself unable to coordinate his movements properly, resulting in dangerous falls that left him bruised and terrified of attempting normal childhood activities. The youngest Mitchell child, 3-year-old Emma, was experiencing developmental regression that erased months of progress in language acquisition and social skills. The toddler who had been learning to speak in complete sentences was reverting to babbling and crying, apparently unable to access the vocabulary she had previously mastered. The systematic destruction of the Mitchell family was being repeated throughout London's sanitised districts as the summer heat triggered acute episodes in residents whose chronic exposure had reached critical thresholds. Families who had maintained some semblance of normal function during the winter months found themselves confronting medical emergencies that overwhelmed their ability to cope with the escalating crisis. William Henderson, the dock worker whose gradual decline had forced him to abandon his career, experienced his first severe neurological episode while walking to the market on a humid July morning. Witnesses reported that he suddenly stopped in the middle of the street, staring blankly at his surroundings as if he had never seen them before, then collapsed in violent convulsions that continued for nearly an hour. When William regained consciousness, he had lost virtually all memory of his adult life. The man who had worked at the docks for over 15 years could not remember his job, his colleagues, or even the location of his workplace. He looked at his wife Ellen with no recognition, asking repeatedly who she was and why she was in his home. The personality changes that accompanied William's acute episode were as devastating as the memory loss. The gentle, patient man, who had been known throughout his neighborhood for his kindness and reliability, had become aggressive and unpredictable, prone to violent outbursts that terrified his family and neighbors. Ellen Henderson found herself caring for a husband who was not only physically and cognitively impaired, but also potentially dangerous to their children and himself. The man she had lived with for 12 years had become a stranger whose behavior was impossible to predict or control through the normal methods of family interaction and mutual understanding. The Henderson children were experiencing their own accelerated decline as the summer conditions intensified the toxic effects of their exposure to the sanitation systems. 10-year-old Michael, who had shown early signs of cognitive impairment during the school year, was now having difficulty with basic functions like eating and personal hygiene that he had mastered years earlier. 7-year-old Susan was developing the same motor control problems that were affecting children throughout the neighborhood, struggling to coordinate her movements in ways that made simple activities like getting dressed or playing with toys increasingly frustrating and eventually impossible. The systematic nature of the family-wide decline was becoming impossible to ignore as summer progressed, and more families experienced acute episodes that revealed the true scope of the disaster unfolding in London's sanitised districts. The gradual symptoms that had been easy to dismiss or misdiagnose were giving way to obvious medical emergencies that demanded immediate attention and explanation. Dr. James Morrison, who had been serving London's working-class districts throughout the crisis, found his medical practice overwhelmed by patients experiencing acute neurological episodes that exceeded his ability to provide effective treatment. The physician was seeing dozens of cases each week that followed identical patterns of sudden onset, severe symptoms, and progressive deterioration that seemed to resist all conventional interventions. The similarity of symptoms across different families and neighborhoods made it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that these medical emergencies were caused by individual health problems or random disease outbreaks. The patients were experiencing identical types of seizures, memory loss, personality changes, and organ dysfunction that suggested systematic exposure to specific toxic compounds. Dr. Morrison's attempts to document these patterns were hampered by the same restrictions on medical investigation that were affecting physicians throughout London. His reports about the acute episodes were classified as confidential medical information that could not be shared with colleagues or used for research purposes without special government authorization. The restrictions were enforced through increased surveillance of medical facilities and personnel who might have access to information about the escalating health crisis. Government agents posing as patients or administrative staff monitored conversations and medical records to identify physicians who might be sharing unauthorized information about the systematic nature of the neurological emergencies. The atmosphere of surveillance and suppression was creating new challenges for medical professionals who were struggling to provide care for patients experiencing unprecedented health problems. Physicians found themselves unable to consult with colleagues, access relevant research, or implement treatment protocols that might require acknowledging the environmental causes of their patients' symptoms. Dr. Margaret Thornfield's work at the Yorkshire facility provided the most comprehensive documentation of the acute phase symptoms. But her research was conducted under conditions of absolute secrecy that prevented her findings from being used to develop effective treatments or protect the public from continued exposure. The patients at the facility were experiencing acute episodes with increasing frequency and severity as summer progressed. The neurological crises that had been occasional events during the spring months were becoming daily occurrences that required constant medical supervision and intervention. The progression of symptoms at the facility revealed the systematic nature of the toxic effects and their inevitable progression toward complete incapacitation or death. Patients who had arrived with relatively mild cognitive impairment were developing severe neurological damage that destroyed their ability to function independently or recognize their own family members. Dr. Thornfield's medical records documented the predictable sequence of deterioration that began with memory problems and personality changes, progressed through motor control difficulties and seizures, and eventually resulted in complete neurological collapse that left patients in vegetative states, requiring total care. The physician's attempts to develop treatments that might slow or reverse this progression were hampered by the lack of understanding about the specific toxic compounds causing the damage and the advanced state of neurological deterioration in most patients by the time they reached the facility. The experimental treatments that Dr. Thornfield attempted provided temporary relief for some symptoms, but could not address the fundamental damage caused by months or years of exposure to the toxic compounds. The interventions that showed the most promise required resources and expertise that were not available at the isolated facility where political considerations took precedence over medical effectiveness. The failure to develop effective treatments was particularly frustrating because Dr. Thornfield's research had identified several approaches that might be successful if implemented during the early stages of toxic exposure. But the patients reaching the facility had typically been exposed to the sanitation systems for extended periods before their symptoms became severe enough to warrant removal from their homes. The delay in treatment was a direct consequence of the cover-up efforts that prevented early identification and intervention for families experiencing the gradual onset symptoms. By the time patients were acknowledged to need specialized care, the neurological damage was typically too advanced for any available treatments to produce meaningful improvement. The systematic failure to provide timely medical intervention represented another layer of tragedy in the unfolding disaster. Families were not only being poisoned by the sanitation systems, but were also being denied access to treatments that might have helped them if provided during the early stages of their exposure. Sir William Hartwell's engineering modifications to the sewage systems had produced some reduction in the toxic compounds being generated, but the improvements were insufficient to prevent the acute episodes that were becoming increasingly common throughout London's sanitised districts. The fundamental design problems that created the toxic conditions could not be resolved through partial modifications that left the basic infrastructure intact. The engineer's private correspondence with government officials revealed his growing desperation as he realized that effective solutions would require completely rebuilding the sanitation network using different design principles and materials. The scale and cost of such reconstruction would be enormous, requiring acknowledgement that the original systems had been catastrophically flawed from their inception. The political impossibility of implementing comprehensive solutions meant that Hartwell's modifications were essentially cosmetic changes that might reduce some symptoms while leaving the fundamental causes of the crisis unaddressed. The families experiencing acute episodes were not benefiting from the engineering improvements because their exposure had already reached levels that would continue causing progressive damage, regardless of minor reductions in ongoing contamination. The engineer found himself in the impossible position of knowing exactly what needed to be done to protect London's population while being prevented from implementing those solutions by the same political and economic forces that had created the disaster in the first place. His technical expertise was being subordinated to damage control priorities that emphasized concealment over problem solving. The summer of 1859 marked a turning point in the sanitation crisis as the acute episodes began affecting families from London's most prominent social circles, making it increasingly difficult to suppress public awareness of the systematic nature of the health problems. The wealthy and influential families who had been the most enthusiastic supporters of the sanitation reforms were becoming its most visible victims. Lady Catherine Ashworth's daughter Penelope experienced her first severe neurological episode during a formal dinner party attended by several members of Parliament and their wives. The child's violent seizures and subsequent loss of consciousness created a medical emergency that could not be concealed from influential witnesses who possessed the social connections to demand explanations and investigations. The public nature of Penelope's crisis forced government officials to develop new strategies for managing acute episodes that occurred in settings where complete suppression of information would be impossible. The solutions they implemented revealed the sophisticated nature of the cover-up operation and the resources that were being devoted to preventing public disclosure of the health crisis. Dr. Harrison Blackwood was summoned immediately to treat Penelope, but his medical intervention was accompanied by a team of government officials who managed the information flow surrounding the incident. The witnesses to the child's seizures were individually contacted and persuaded to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from discussing what they had observed. The confidentiality agreements were enforced through a combination of financial incentives and subtle threats that made it clear that violation of the secrecy requirements would result in serious personal and professional consequences. The witnesses were offered government positions, business opportunities, and social advantages in exchange for their cooperation with efforts to suppress information about the incident. The systematic approach to managing individual cases of acute episodes revealed the extent to which the cover-up had become an elaborate institutional operation that consumed enormous resources while serving no purpose other than protecting the reputations and investments of those responsible for the disaster. The Pemberton family's twin sons, Edward and Charles, experienced simultaneous acute episodes during a rowing competition attended by hundreds of spectators from London's social elite. The public nature of their collapse created a crisis management challenge that required immediate deployment of the full resources available to the secret committee overseeing the cover-up. The young men's seizures were attributed to heat exhaustion and athletic overexertion, explanations that were supported by carefully orchestrated medical testimony and witness statements that diverted attention from the systematic nature of their symptoms. The spectators who had observed the incident were systematically contacted and persuaded to accept official explanations that minimized the medical significance of what they had witnessed. The success of these damage control efforts required the cooperation of dozens of physicians, government officials, and other professionals who possessed knowledge about the true nature of the neurological emergencies, but were prevented from sharing that knowledge through the elaborate system of incentives and threats that maintained the conspiracy of silence. The human cost of maintaining this deception was becoming unbearable for many of the individuals forced to participate in it. Medical professionals found themselves violating their fundamental obligation to protect public health while watching helplessly as preventable suffering continued to claim new victims throughout London's sanitized districts. The psychological pressure on physicians was particularly intense because they possessed the knowledge necessary to understand the scope of the disaster while being prevented from using that knowledge to help their patients or protect the public from continued exposure. The systematic suppression of medical expertise represented an attack on the professional values that had motivated their careers and defined their identities as healers. Dr. Whitmore's private journals from this period revealed the internal struggle experienced by physicians who understood the true nature of the crisis but were powerless to address it through normal professional channels. His entries describe the moral anguish of watching families suffer from preventable illness while being forbidden to provide them with accurate information about the causes of their symptoms or effective strategies for protecting themselves from continued harm. The physician's documentation of individual cases became increasingly detailed and desperate as he struggled to preserve evidence that might eventually be used to hold accountable those responsible for creating and perpetuating the disaster. His records represented a systematic indictment of the institutional failures that had transformed London's greatest technological achievement into its most devastating public health catastrophe. The evidence that Dr. Whitmore was accumulating provided comprehensive documentation of systematic poisoning on a scale that exceeded any previous disaster in human history. But this evidence remained hidden in private journals that could not be shared or published without exposing the physician to retaliation from powerful interests who were determined to protect their investments and reputations. The isolation of individual physicians who possessed crucial information about the crisis represented one of the most effective aspects of the cover-up strategy. By preventing medical professionals from communicating with each other about their observations, the secret committee was able to maintain the fiction that the health problems were isolated incidents rather than systematic consequences of environmental poisoning. The summer heat continued to intensify the chemical reactions within London's sewage systems, creating conditions that accelerated the onset of acute episodes throughout the city's sanitized districts. The families who had managed to maintain some semblance of normal function during the earlier phases of the crisis found themselves confronting medical emergencies that overwhelmed their ability to cope with the escalating disaster. The children who were experiencing the most severe effects of the toxic exposure had become living symbols of everything that was wrong with the entire enterprise of technological progress pursued without adequate consideration of unintended consequences. Their innocent suffering represented the price that societies pay when innovation proceeds faster than understanding and when economic interests take precedence over human welfare. The systematic destruction of young lives was particularly heartbreaking because these children had been the intended beneficiaries of the sanitation reforms. Their parents had invested in modern conveniences specifically to protect their families from the health hazards and social problems associated with primitive living conditions. The tragic irony was that these well-intentioned efforts to provide better lives for their children had instead exposed them to dangers far greater than anything they might have faced under the traditional systems that the sewage networks were designed to replace. The parents' love and concern for their children's welfare had been weaponized against the very people they were trying to protect. The children themselves had no understanding of the forces that were destroying their futures, or the complex institutional failures that prevented effective intervention on their behalf. They trusted the adults around them to protect them from harm, never imagining that their parents' faith in progress and expertise would expose them to systematic poisoning that would rob them of their minds, their health, and their potential for productive lives. As summer reached its peak, the toxic effects of London's sanitation systems continued to claim new victims, while the elaborate machinery of deception and suppression grew more desperate and more vulnerable to the exposure that would eventually reveal the full scope of humanity's most well-intentioned disaster. The gleaming pipes and revolutionary engineering that had once symbolized the triumph of human ingenuity over primitive conditions had become instruments of systematic destruction, proving that even the most sophisticated technologies could become weapons against the very people they were designed to serve. The children whose futures were being sacrificed to protect institutional reputations and financial investments had become unwitting martyrs to the dangers of unquestioned faith in technological solutions to complex social problems. Their suffering would eventually serve as a warning to future generations about the importance of systematic accountability and precautionary principles in the development and implementation of technologies that affect public health and environmental safety. But in the summer of 1859, those lessons remained locked away in secret government files and private medical journals. hidden from the very people who needed them most desperately, as London's revolutionary sanitation systems continued their relentless assault on human health and civilization itself. The breaking point arrived on a suffocating August morning, when the chemical reactions within London's sewage network reached such intensity that the toxic compounds began manifesting in ways that could no longer be concealed from public observation. The atmospheric conditions that had been gradually intensifying throughout the summer created a perfect storm of temperature, humidity, and chemical volatility that transformed the invisible poisoning into visible catastrophe. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, wife of the prominent banker Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, was hosting her weekly charity meeting in the elegantly appointed drawing room of their newly sanitized Belgravia mansion when the crisis erupted in full view of London's most influential women. The ladies had gathered to discuss fundraising for orphanages, their conversation flowing pleasantly over delicate china and carefully arranged flowers, when Eleanor suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence and stared blankly at her guests. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Eleanor, who had been known throughout London society for her eloquence and social grace, began speaking in fragments that made no logical connection to the conversation or her surroundings. She would start sentences about charitable work and finish them with references to childhood memories that seemed to emerge from decades past. Lady Margaret Worthington, Eleanor's closest friend, and a frequent collaborator in social causes, initially assumed that Eleanor was suffering from the heat, or perhaps experiencing feminine hysteria that occasionally affected women of their social standing. But Eleanor's condition rapidly deteriorated beyond anything that could be attributed to temporary indisposition. The woman who had managed complex charitable organizations and coordinated elaborate social events began exhibiting behavior that suggested complete disconnection from reality. She would pick up teacups and stare at them, as if she had never seen such objects before. She would address her guests by names of people who had been dead for years. Most disturbing, she began removing her clothing in front of the assembled ladies, apparently unaware of the social impropriety of her actions. Lady Worthington summoned Dr. Harrison Blackwood immediately, but the physician found himself confronting symptoms that exceeded anything he had observed during his previous treatment of sanitation-related illness. Eleanor's acute episode was more severe and more public than the cases he had been managing discreetly at the Yorkshire facility. The presence of prominent witnesses made it impossible to implement the usual procedures for suppressing information about neurological emergencies. The ladies who had observed Eleanor's breakdown possessed the social connections and influence necessary to demand explanations that could not be dismissed through the normal methods of intimidation and financial incentive. Dr. Blackwood's examination revealed that Eleanor was experiencing massive neurological disruption that affected multiple brain functions simultaneously. Her ability to process language, recognize familiar objects, and maintain awareness of her social environment had been severely compromised within the span of a few hours. The physician recognized that Eleanor's symptoms represented an extreme manifestation of the toxic effects he had been documenting at the secret facility, but the public nature of her crisis created unprecedented challenges for maintaining the cover-up that had concealed the systematic nature of the health problems affecting London's sanitized districts. The government officials who arrived within hours of Eleanor's collapse implemented emergency procedures for managing acute episodes that occurred in socially prominent settings. The witnesses to Eleanor's breakdown were immediately isolated and subjected to intensive persuasion designed to convince them that they had misunderstood what they had observed. Lady Worthington and the other charity meeting attendees were visited by teams of physicians, government representatives, and social authorities who provided alternative explanations for Eleanor's behavior that minimized its medical significance. The women were told that Eleanor had been suffering from a rare nervous disorder that created temporary confusion but was not contagious or environmentally related. The explanations were supported by carefully prepared medical documentation that attributed Eleanor's symptoms to inherited conditions, feminine hysteria, or psychological stress related to her charitable responsibilities. The physicians involved in these deception efforts were required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from discussing the true nature of Eleanor's illness with colleagues or family members. But the elaborate efforts to suppress information about Eleanor's crisis were complicated by similar incidents occurring simultaneously throughout London's most exclusive neighbourhoods. The same atmospheric conditions that had triggered Eleanor's acute episode were affecting dozens of other residents of sanitised buildings, creating a cluster of neurological emergencies that made individual case management increasingly difficult. Lord Pemberton himself experienced a severe episode while presiding over a parliamentary committee meeting devoted to urban development policies. The minister who had championed London's sanitation reforms found himself unable to recognise his colleagues or remember the purpose of the legislative session he was supposed to be conducting. The parliamentary episode was particularly dangerous for the cover-up because it occurred in front of government officials who possessed detailed knowledge about the sanitation systems and their potential health effects. Lord Pemberton's colleagues could not be dismissed or intimidated in the same ways that had been effective with private citizens who lacked political influence. The crisis in Parliament forced the secret committee to implement emergency protocols that had been developed for scenarios where high-ranking government officials became victims of the sanitation-related illness. Lord Pemberton was immediately removed from public view and transported to a private medical facility where his condition could be managed without creating additional political complications. The official explanation for Lord Pemberton's sudden absence from Parliament cited exhaustion and overwork related to his demanding governmental responsibilities. His colleagues were briefed individually about his supposed need for extended medical leave that would prevent him from participating in legislative activities for an indefinite period. The removal of Lord Pemberton from his position created a power vacuum within the government structure responsible for managing the sanitation crisis. The minister who had been most knowledgeable about the engineering and policy aspects of the sewage systems was no longer available to provide guidance for the increasingly complex challenges facing the cover-up operation. Sir Charles Whitmore, Lord Pemberton's deputy, assumed responsibility for coordinating the government response to the escalating health crisis, but he lacked his predecessor's detailed understanding of the technical and political factors that had created the disaster. His decisions were often reactive rather than strategic, responding to immediate crises without considering their long-term implications for maintaining the conspiracy of silence. The leadership transition occurred at the worst possible moment, as the summer heat was creating conditions that accelerated the toxic effects of the sanitation systems throughout London's most prominent neighbourhoods. Families who had experienced gradual decline during previous months were suddenly confronting acute medical emergencies that demanded immediate attention and explanation. The Earl of Worthington's entire household experienced simultaneous neurological crises during a formal dinner party attended by foreign diplomats and international business leaders. The systematic collapse of the family and their servants in front of influential foreign observers created diplomatic complications that threatened to expose the health crisis to international scrutiny. The Earl himself was found wandering through his mansion's garden at midnight, completely naked and apparently unable to recognise his own property or understand his location. His wife, the Countess, was discovered in the kitchen attempting to cook dinner for guests who had fled hours earlier, following recipes that existed only in her deteriorating memory. The Worthington children were experiencing seizures and behavioural changes that made their conditions impossible to conceal from the household staff and visiting dignitaries who witnessed their acute episodes. The systematic nature of the family-wide breakdown made it obvious that environmental factors were responsible for their simultaneous illness. The foreign observers who witnessed the Worthington family's crisis possessed diplomatic immunity that made them resistant to the intimidation tactics that had been effective with British citizens. Their reports to their home governments created international awareness of health problems in London that could not be suppressed through domestic censorship and information control. Sir Charles Whitmore found himself managing not only a public health catastrophe, but also a diplomatic crisis that threatened to expose the sanitation disaster to international investigation and criticism. Foreign governments were beginning to ask questions about the safety of London's revolutionary infrastructure and its potential effects on their own citizens who lived or conducted business in the British capital. The international dimension of the crisis required new approaches to information management that extended beyond the domestic strategies that had been developed for suppressing awareness among British citizens. Foreign diplomatic services possessed independent sources of information and communication networks that made them difficult to control through the methods that had been effective within London's medical and governmental establishments. Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, the Prussian embassy physician, had been treating German citizens who were experiencing mysterious symptoms similar to those affecting British residents of sanitized buildings. His medical training and diplomatic status provided him with both the expertise to recognize the systematic nature of the health problems and the protection necessary to investigate them without fear of retaliation from British authorities. Dr. Hartmann's reports to the Prussian government provided the first comprehensive external assessment of London's sanitation crisis, documenting patterns of illness among foreign nationals that corresponded exactly with the symptoms being experienced by British citizens in similar circumstances. His medical analysis identified the toxic compounds present in London's sanitized buildings as the most likely cause of the neurological and physical deterioration affecting residents throughout the city. The Prussian physician's findings were shared with other European governments through diplomatic channels that were beyond the reach of British censorship and suppression efforts. Medical authorities in Paris, Vienna, and Rome began receiving detailed information about the health hazards associated with London's sewage systems, creating international awareness that threatened to undermine confidence in British engineering expertise and urban planning capabilities. The international spread of information about the sanitation crisis forced Sir Charles Whitmore to develop new strategies for damage control that addressed foreign as well as domestic concerns about the safety of London's revolutionary infrastructure. The approaches that had been effective for managing British physicians and citizens were inadequate for addressing the concerns of foreign governments, who possessed independent means of investigation and communication. The government's response to international scrutiny revealed the enormous resources that were being devoted to suppressing information about the health crisis, rather than addressing its underlying causes. Teams of diplomats, physicians, and technical experts were dispatched to foreign capitals with mission of providing alternative explanations for the health problems being observed among their citizens in London. The international damage control efforts involved systematic deception on a scale that rivaled the domestic cover-up, requiring the coordination of multiple government departments and the cooperation of British diplomatic missions throughout Europe. The complexity and cost of these operations demonstrated the lengths to which authorities were willing to go to protect their investments in sanitation technology rather than acknowledging its systematic failure. But the international efforts to suppress information about the crisis were complicated by the continuing deterioration of conditions within London itself. The summer heat was creating atmospheric conditions that intensified the toxic effects of the sewage systems to levels that made acute episodes increasingly frequent and severe throughout the city's sanitized districts. Dr. Edmund Whitmore's private documentation of the escalating crisis revealed patterns of neurological emergency that were affecting hundreds of families each week. His medical records showed that the acute episodes were becoming more severe and more difficult to conceal as the chemical reactions within the sanitation network reached unprecedented levels of toxicity. The physician's attempts to provide medical care for his patients were hampered by the restrictions on treatment that had been implemented to prevent acknowledgement of environmental causes for their symptoms. He was forbidden to use medications or procedures that might suggest toxic exposure, limiting his interventions to palliative measures that provided temporary relief without addressing the fundamental causes of their illness. The systematic denial of effective medical treatment represented another layer of tragedy in the unfolding disaster. Patients who might have benefited from interventions designed to address toxic exposure were being denied those treatments to preserve the fiction that their symptoms were caused by natural diseases or psychological disorders unrelated to the sanitation systems. Dr. Whitmore's moral anguish intensified as he watched preventable suffering continue to claim new victims while he remained powerless to provide them with the medical interventions that might have helped them. His private journals from this period documented the psychological toll of participating in a system that prioritized institutional protection over human welfare. The physician's isolation from colleagues who shared his understanding of the crisis made his situation even more difficult to endure. The restrictions on professional communication meant that he could not seek advice, share information, or coordinate treatment approaches with other medical professionals who were observing similar patterns among their patients. The conspiracy of silence had created an environment where individual physicians were forced to confront unprecedented medical challenges without access to the collaborative resources that had traditionally supported effective medical practice. The systematic suppression of professional communication represented an attack on the foundations of scientific medicine that made it impossible to develop effective responses to the health crisis. Meanwhile, the engineering modifications that Sir William Hartwell had implemented throughout the summer were proving insufficient to address the fundamental problems created by the original design of the sanitation systems. The partial improvements had reduced some toxic compounds while inadvertently increasing others, creating new patterns of illness that were even more difficult to understand and treat. The unintended consequences of the engineering modifications created additional challenges for physicians who were struggling to provide care for patients experiencing novel combinations of symptoms that did not correspond to any established medical conditions. The constantly changing nature of the toxic exposure made it impossible to develop consistent treatment protocols, even within the constraints imposed by the cover-up requirements. Sir William Hartwell's private correspondence with government officials revealed his growing desperation, as he realized that effective solutions would require acknowledgement of systematic failure that was politically impossible. The engineer found himself implementing modifications that he knew were inadequate, while being prevented from pursuing comprehensive solutions that might actually protect London's population from continued harm. The fundamental design flaws that created the toxic conditions could not be addressed through partial modifications that preserved the basic infrastructure and maintained the fiction that the sanitation systems were fundamentally sound. Effective solutions would require complete replacement of the sewage network using different materials and design principles that would implicitly acknowledge the catastrophic failure of the original systems. The political and economic impossibility of implementing comprehensive solutions meant that Hartwell's engineering efforts were essentially cosmetic changes that might provide temporary relief while leaving the underlying causes of the crisis unaddressed. The families experiencing acute episodes were not benefiting from his modifications because their exposure had already reached levels that would continue causing progressive damage, regardless of minor improvements in ongoing contamination. The engineer's technical expertise was being subordinated to political considerations that prevented him from implementing the solutions that his professional knowledge told him were necessary. The systematic suppression of engineering expertise paralleled the restrictions being imposed on medical professionals, creating conditions where technical knowledge was subordinated to institutional interests that prioritized reputation over public welfare. As August reached its peak, the atmospheric conditions that had been intensifying the toxic effects of London's sanitation systems created a final surge in acute episodes that overwhelmed the government's ability to manage individual cases through the methods that had been effective during earlier phases of the crisis. The sheer number of neurological emergencies occurring simultaneously throughout the city's sanitized districts made comprehensive suppression of information increasingly difficult to maintain. The children who were experiencing the most severe effects of the toxic exposure had become unwitting symbols of everything that was wrong with the entire enterprise of technological progress, pursued without adequate consideration of unintended consequences or systematic accountability for harmful outcomes. Their innocent suffering represented the price that societies pay when innovation proceeds faster than understanding and when economic interests take precedence over human welfare. The systematic destruction of young lives was particularly heartbreaking because these children had been the intended beneficiaries of the sanitation reforms that were now destroying their futures. Their parents had invested in modern conveniences, specifically to protect their families from the health hazards and social problems associated with primitive living conditions, never imagining that their well-intentioned efforts would expose their children to dangers far greater than anything they might have faced under traditional systems. And so, dear friend, as we reach the end of this haunting journey through London's most devastating triumph, we're left with a chilling reminder that progress without wisdom becomes destruction in disguise. The gleaming pipes that promised salvation became instruments of systematic poisoning, transforming humanity's greatest sanitary achievement into its most tragic failure. The children whose laughter once filled those sanitized streets would never know the futures stolen from them by the very innovations meant to secure their prosperity. Their story stands as an eternal warning that when we chase tomorrow without questioning today, we risk sacrificing everything we sought to protect on the altar of unexamined faith in progress itself.